My name is Frances Anderton. I'm a long-time journalist, spent many years focusing on architecture, design, and the arts, and I've had the great privilege to be able to support MOCA in producing with my colleague Livia Mandul the series that's starting tonight. This series is born of an initiative that was launched by MOCA in 2020, and that is the founding of the MOCA Environmental Council. It's been supported by the Manitou Fund, and over the past year, MOCA's been hosting programs, exhibitions, tours, and conversations that illuminate many dimensions of the climate crisis and arts, and how the arts are dealing with it. Today, we're commencing a series of 5 conversations under the umbrella title of Art for Earth's Sake. It's a series in which the art world turns the mirror upon itself, considering not only the artistic expression of the collective anxieties that many of us are feeling around the warming planet, the disappearance of species, rising seas, excessive pollution, many other consequences of our human imprint, but the series also asks the question, what about the carbon footprint of the art world itself? Because you could say that in the past 30 or 40 years, the world of fine art has itself become overheated in audience, in global reach, in prices, in consumption of resources, and in being both interpreter and embodiment of late capitalism. So, over the coming weeks, artists, academics, activists, industry insiders, and journalists are going to explore topics ranging from greening art facilities and art fairs to reckoning with environmental justice or injustice, and considering whether technology has some answers. And tonight, you're going to be guinea pigs in a wonderful experiment we're going to test here in terms of how technology might impact making the global more local. And finally, the program's going to consider how much considering the climate as part of our processes and mode of expression actually impacts artistic expression. So we're starting now with The Art World Meets the Crisis. This will set the tone for the series. It's going to take a broad look at how the art world can use its outsized cultural influence to bring about change inside and out of the art industry. We'll ask questions like, is it time to focus more on our local art communities, and cultivate those regional voices, or can we go global while staying in place with a little help from technology? Those are just some of the questions that are going to be asked by our moderator, who is MOCA curator Alex Sloane. She, like me, I'm afraid, has a British accent, excuse that. But I am happy to hand off to her, and she will take it from here. Alex.
Hi, my name is Alex Sloane. Just a little quick housekeeping before we start. Could everyone please just make sure they are off their Wi-Fi, just to make sure we don't have any glitches later on. Just to give a little bit of context for this afternoon's panel, we're going to be in sort of 2 sections. First, we have here Michael Wang, Debra Scacco, and Russell Fortmeyer. We're going to talk for a little bit, and then I'll be joined by David Nussbaum and Bonnie Brennan, and we'll have a further conversation, bring it all together as a group, and then open it up for Q&A as well. The focus of this conversation is not about individual artist talks or presentations, although there's going to be some really interesting projects that are being discussed, but rather an active discussion about how, on the one hand, there are art projects that draw attention to the climate crisis and initiatives being implemented to curb the impact of art making and exhibition making on the environment, and yet, on the other hand, how we need to acknowledge how the art industry is an active participant in this crisis, and how our collective choice to participate in the art world, makes us all complicit. Just as sort of thoughts to consider as we start. The boundless travel of the art industry, art world, private jets to art fairs, global shipments to fairs, museums, auctions, exhibition waste, walls that go up 1 month to be torn down 3 months later, 24/7 climate-controlled galleries. These are just a couple of things. And also sort of the murky entanglements of the art world and its funders. Basically, how we, all have to collectively accept that there is a crisis in order to really address it. So we have artists, Michael Wang and Debra Scacco. We have engineer and architect, Russell Fortmeyer. Later we'll have technologist, an innovator, David Nussbaum, and Bonnie Brennan, who's the president of Christie's America. So and I, as a curator at a museum, all bringing different perspectives into this conversation. So yeah, we're going to start off, Michael, with you, although as we've discussed, everyone jump in whenever they feel like it. Michael, you are, as an artist whose practice sort of uses systems that operate at a global scale, media addressing climate change, species distribution, resource allocation, the global economy. This is a project from 2012, Carbon Copies. Can you talk a little bit about how this project emerged? It was sort of very critical of artists who are, in the course of making their projects, consuming inordinate amounts of carbon. This was also 10 years ago. So if you can talk a little bit about its origins, how it was received at the time, but also how you feel about it now, 10 years later.
Sure. So the image that's on the screen right now is the poster for this first exhibition of Carbon Copies. It sort of borrows the format of a kind of typical art forum ad for a group show. But what I did is I found ways of calculating the carbon footprints of quite well-known contemporary artworks. And so the numbers that are listed after each name, that would be the tons of carbon that I calculated associated with an artwork by some kind of quite well-known artist. What I did after calculating these footprints, and I found kind of different ways of doing that for each work. Some like this here would be embodied carbon. So here, I think it's a Jan Vo piece for We the People, and I found out, there were 31 tons of copper used in this work. So I could figure out what the carbon footprint of that tonnage of copper would be. And it looks like it was about 84 tons of CO2. I created these small models, mostly out of paper, things like that, to represent that kind of invisible footprint. And then I created this kind of catalog, like you see here, that tells the story of how I calculated that footprint, but also gives a price. And that price is because I was selling these, what I call carbon copies, in exchange for carbon offsets. So when these little maquettes were sold, it was sort of erasing that footprint of the original work. So it kind of set up a kind of an alternative economy for an artwork. It was shown in a commercial gallery that then was kind of accomplishing this gesture of erasure in the atmosphere.
This was sort of in 2012, kind of at the vanguard of talking about carbon, specifically carbon emissions in the context of art objects. How was the reception? And did you get any kind of, my question really was, what were the comments of the artist? Did anyone make any comments? Was there any kind of feedback to you in that respect?
Yeah, I actually never heard from any of the artists about this. And I did have to kind of make some kind of queries with some of their galleries to get just enough information to make some of these calculations. So some people kind of knew what I was doing. I think something that's important for me is obviously there's some element that's, especially for some of the works, that there's some element of critique about maybe the kind of excessive energy invested in some of these artworks. But it was I used a very kind of expansive way of thinking about the carbon footprint of a work. It could be, I was kind of thinking of a work as part of all these kinds of networks of display, or so it could be the moving of a work to a location. It could be about the assistants flying back and forth to create a work. It could even be, in some cases, I calculated a number of people flying to a remote location for the opening of a show. So it was this very expanded idea of what actually the work was. But so there's this reading where it's sort of okay, it's a critique of all of that. And that's probably part of the work, but I think for me it was also just a way of showing that all artists are, on some level, air artists, that their works have this sort of invisible impact on the atmosphere, and that's another way of thinking about what a work is, or some aspect of the work that's usually overlooked. And then, so for me, the gesture of offsetting them was kind of proposing another kind of practice that would actually work directly with the air as a kind of artistic media.
I liked the difference between a calculating Marina Abramovich's footprint when the artist is present. You're looking at sort of the energy that MoMA expended through light bulbs and things in the atrium versus, a Richard Serra, large scale sculpture, which, seems more of it is more, but it's that's more of a visible footprint than something like Marina sitting in a chair.
Yeah, having both these sort of ephemeral effects and then these sort of like really embodied material, kind of materials that can be measured for their embodied carbon. Kind of having those things side by side.
This was the certificate to confirm.
Yeah, exactly. I worked with a carbon offset company then to so it's sort of piggybacking on that system of carbon offsets in order to kind of carry out this sort of like overlapping the kind of systems in place in a commercial gallery with this sort of existing system of carbon offset, sort of finding a way to bring those two things together.
And then now this project, which is the Drowned World, I liked this project and another project that's coming up, and your recent manifesto on photosynthesis, looking at how, basically this change of value systems, which is also something that Debra speaks a lot about in your work. How can we reconfigure, what we put value on? And here, I think, Michael, you're talking about more plants over industry, and this idea of how can we, shift that 20th century kind of mindset where everything is fixated on speed, industry, consumption, more, and think about, okay, if we, original carbon, millennia ago, plants, how can this sort of right the wrongs almost?
Yeah, so in this project, I was recreating a kind of living carboniferous forest, so the kind of forest that produced coal 300 million years ago, as planted this artificial forest, but out of living kind of descendants of those ancient forests. But it's installed in the kind of ruins of a coal gas plant. So it's sort of like in the very site where coal, these sort of ancient organisms, were incinerated. This forest is kind of overtaking that ruin, that kind of ruined fossil fuel infrastructure, I guess. And so for me, it was sort of, this is sort of a video just sort of showing, moving through the forest up into, you can see the industrial site that it was installed in. It was a way, like, as you were saying, to like use plants to actually, again, kind of directly intervene in the carbon cycle, this relationship between living things, fossil fuels, and the air. But it was also, it's not just, I think there was actually, just to talk about other kind of one-sided readings of the work, I think for some people they saw this and they saw it almost as an apology for fossil fuel expenditures, to say that, okay, well, the burning of fossil fuels will now allow this kind of beautiful forest to reemerge. And that's part of the story, the kind of science fiction story of the work, would say that as we restore this ancient atmosphere, these ancient forests can return. It's a sort of like 300 million year cycle coming full circle. But to me, like, even though there's something beautiful about the forest, it's also a very kind of sinister and dystopian vision, because it's this site is actually very toxic. Actually, visitors weren't allowed to walk in it. And it's kind of to me, it kind of hypothesizes this forest returning at a time when maybe there are no longer, it's no longer the world we know. It may be a time after humans can inhabit the earth. So I think there's this kind of dystopian side to the work too.
Debra or Russell, any comments so far?
I would just say I really appreciate that the idea of this kind of dystopian vision of these things that we very much take for granted that are at risk, right? So that's something that I've worked with a few times as well, in thinking about this idea of extraction to extinction, and also the value of the object over the value of a process or the value of a life, right? So really thinking about this this idea of kind of infinite growth and extraction and the more, right? And how that impacts not just the global, but also very much the local as well.
Well, and is this on? I think it's on. Okay. I would just add that I think that last work is a really important model for us in design to think about restorative landscapes, restorative projects that actually, in sustainability circles, you would contrast the footprint with a handprint, which is intentional and that you're making change. And I think as a design motive, I think that's where we have to lead, right? In the future is look at, because every landscaping, there is no nature. Everything's been irreparably changed by human choices, right? And human impact. So how can we make an intentional choice in the design project or art practices to really, restore what we have?
Yeah, and I think, so this is this was another project which, again, kind of looks at some of these issues, but I wanted to really focus in on this manifesto of photosynthesis. Too many thrillers. Because I like this idea, this inversion of the futurist manifesto, 100 years later, and thinking about how, this is I'm not sure you can probably read it, but the final point of Michael's manifesto is the 20th century extolled expenditure. Now we celebrate fluorescence. And I think it's, again bringing it back around to how we can think about different value systems and also how we can, are we being hypocritical? I think, Michael, my final question to you is, do you think that the art industry is hypocritical when it praises projects like yours, critically and press and audience and gallery attention, but does not fully address it in its own internal practices?
Well, maybe I'll first, mention the manifesto, which I agree, I can't say photosynthesis either, so I guess it's not going to probably catch on. But I thought it sounded kind of funny. It's basically it's proposing a new movement, sort of in kind of taking on the model of sort of the different isms of modernism, but instead kind of countering a lot of the modernist avant-gardes that kind of extol the virtues of industrialization, sort of flipping that and looking at the plant world as a model for a carbon negative future, and sort of celebrating the kind of luxuriance of the vegetal world as sort of a new kind of aesthetic ideal that kind of now just turns the page on the 20th century celebration of industry and of kind of fossil fuel use and kind of energy expenditure. So I hope there's something in it that I can live up to. I think my practice up to this point, I think I kind of, in some small ways, have sort of aspired to something like this, at least in part. Like that work from the Drowned World, I think they're just working with plants was a way to create a forest as an artwork. I think that was kind of tapping into some of the ideas that I'm fleshing out here more explicitly. But I think it's very hard not to be hypocritical. It's very hard to be, this is a very small thing, but one of the things the manifesto does is sort of compares human metabolism and all animal metabolism to fossil fuel use. And so our living and breathing is carbon positive. So there's some way that you can't escape that kind of being kind of a contributor to carbon emissions. It's who we are as human beings. But that said, obviously, there are kind of extreme excesses of the last 100 years that have really thrown all of the carbon cycle out of whack. So I do think it's sort of not just as an artist, but as kind of citizens of this planet, there is a kind of demand to help address this issue, but it's just as kind of embedded in the systems that we are, in a capitalist system, in this kind of these extractive economies. It's very hard to kind of extricate yourself from that entirely.
Agreed, and I think that kind of brings us nicely into some of the things, Debra, that you address. Oh, God. In your practice. So Debra, you have a very research-based practice that spans, creation of studio works, installations, public art, curation, education, writing, community engagement, oral history. It's an ongoing list of many, many hats. And in addition, you alongside your studio practice, you are a founding director of the climate-focused creative AIR, organizing member of Artists Commit, co-director of Getty Pacific Standard Time, and the co-founder of Artworker Mutual Aid Cooperative Contemporary Los Angeles Art League. This is many roles and many, this is how like art and activism intersect in such a really real way. And I just want to begin with, like, what do you see the artist's role as? Like, how do you see, you're not a scientist, you're not a politician, but how do you think that you can, as an artist, be a provocateur, like something that is constantly niggling at institutions and the wider society?
That's a big question. So, so of course, I mean, I am one person, so I speak for myself and my practice. But I think, as you say, I do wear many hats, and I think to a certain degree, I kind of organize my way out of feeling like I'm in a crisis. And so whenever something terrible happens, I'm like, oh God, I have to start something new, or I have to like go volunteer somewhere or whatever. So I think a lot of the more kind of on the ground work that I'm doing is in part because my own work is very research-based. It's very rooted in ecology and borders and boundaries and this very sticky kind of intersection where you cannot separate historic racism from environmental policy, from immigration reform. All of these things are connected and are more connected now than they've ever been, right? So I think that's really, that sort of section of the Venn diagram is really where my work exists. And I think I feel that whatever agency I may have, or privilege I may have, or platform I may have, I want to initiate both dialogue and action around the things that really matter to me. And so I think that's where, the community organizing and the oral history and all of that has really become a part of the work that I do as a way to, in some ways, to try and figure out what is my personal role as an artist in this. And, I think there have been moments, especially over the last 7-8 years, where I think, oh my God, is being an artist enough, right? And the number of times where I'm like, I have to get a job working for this organization or that. That's not helpful, right? It's like we're all in a crisis. Everyone is having this moment. And actually, I just think this is what I do. This is what I have done for 25 years, right? So I really just think about what can I contribute both through the vehicle of being a communicator through my work, and even if that's just like making bright, shiny things to trick somebody into having a conversation about water policy or immigration reform, but also what other skills do I have that can start to contribute to that. So you mentioned that I work with Artists Commit, which is a group that started in New York, and it's an artist-led group to really think about how to, as an art world, as a world that is rooted in immense amounts of waste, like how can we hold ourselves accountable to this and also support each other through this? And so I think there is no perfection in this, just by, as you say, Michael, like by the virtue of being alive, we are all consumers, right? So it's really to think about, okay, let's acknowledge, number one, the scale of our industry, of the art industry. I think there's, as artists, I think in some ways we get away with a lot, and so I use that to my advantage as much as I possibly can. It's like the power of underestimation is amazing. So I'm like, great, underestimate me, right? See how far I can go with this. But also then really establishing a kind of a collective way of moving forward. And I think that's something that the art world, generally speaking, is very secretive. It's very opaque. And collaboration in the art world, in certain sections of the art world, is not very common, right? And so one of the things I really love about Artists Commit is that it's about really transparently saying, this is the carbon cost, effectively, of this project. And it's about practice, not perfect. It's about really like if the one thing that you can do is measure your flights, by the virtue of doing that and by the virtue that you have signed up to do this, you will reduce the amount of air travel when you can, right? So it's really just about having this kind of systems change of thinking in like a more cradle to grave mentality, and also thinking just where is the waste, and really thinking about how to address that.
Just to follow up on that with Russell, you were talking about sort of ethical procurement when we spoke earlier, and I think this sort of segues well with what Debra was saying. How it's not just about, and Michael, it's not just about carbon emissions and counting carbon emissions. It's also about how can we think about things from the offset, so that you're not having to offset anything, literally, but you're buying local, you're getting things locally, and I remember also you mentioned something about there are climate winners and losers, and I think that stuck with me so much, but I think it comes back to what Debra is saying about how we can think about things from the beginning and try and limit our sort of the scale, well, not the scale or scope, but where things are coming from. And I just wondered if you can talk a little bit about that.
Sure. I know. Well, what I was thinking of when you were just talking here about how closed so many industries are, and sort of anti-collaborative in a way. Even though I know there's lots of collaborative art practices, but as an industry, it's not collaborative. And I was sort of thinking, how dumb is it that we're thinking of sustainability as some sort of competitive advantage, right? Like, oh, look, my practices are better than yours. It's like, no, share. If you've got a good idea, share it. Because if you can't tell, the planet's on fire. So I was going to be, and it's Sunday night, I know, so I'm sorry to go kind of doom and gloomy. But I was thinking about, like, what do I want to say in front of artists, and since I'm not an artist, and I didn't want to show images because I'm not an artist, and I think that, I spend my days talking about carbon and helping clients think through their carbon impact and all the things that means, and I think that's very important because it has a lot of side effects around air quality and environmental contamination that affect our health, and we all live in Southern California, so we all know what that means. And so it's very important that we still center carbon as an issue. But I would say increasingly in design, and I think art, some art practices are definitely doing this, but most aren't, is thinking about the question of who, because who benefits from this focus on carbon. Because the reality is, the ship sailed on hitting our carbon reduction targets. Like, the Paris Climate Accord in 2015 was all about hitting 1.5 degrees Celsius warming, and we've sailed way past that, right? We're now going to probably trend toward 3 degrees, which is catastrophic. And so I think in architecture, at least, and I do see this in art, but in architecture, there's been a pivot to this question of ethics and looking at supply chain not just through the lens of carbon, but through the lens of the people and the communities that our consumption impacts. So in goods and services, art is a good or service. I'm sorry, I hate to say that, but it's a good or service. And 80% of the emissions for a city like Los Angeles associated with art occur elsewhere, which means there's another community whose air quality is impacted, whose water quality is impacted because you bought art in Los Angeles, right? And so I think, there's been a lot of developments in architecture in the last, say, couple of years, creating frameworks to help designers deal with this, because it's a colossal issue. And when you have a building project, unlike, say, maybe a painting where you might, or whatever media you're using, you might have 4 or 5, well, I'm grossly simplifying it, maybe even 100 different products and different categories of things that are going into the thing. In architecture, you have thousands, right? Thousands and thousands of things that you're managing through a design process, and understanding where that's coming from is a huge task, but it really, it forces you to ask that question. What's the quality of life for the people who are making our quality of life possible? So I think that's, I like to call that ethical procurement, and I think we have so far to go on that, and certainly in the art world too.
Yeah, I think it's as I think the art industry, as in any industry really, it's what is the easiest and cheapest and fastest option is often the one that wins. And I think, this is, going back to Michael, this idea of value and about, how we can change structures. I mean, there's going to be a lot of good intentions, but once you have, you're talking about institutions, whether that is museums or auction houses, they're already such sort of large, monolithic entities in and of themselves. So when we were talking, I think it was about, my analogy was the shipping, the tanker in the canal, in the Suez Canal, that you have to nudge it with the little tugboat, moving it slowly by degrees. And that's sort of how I see it anyway, how institutions, it's like nothing happens overnight, but I think it's artists, it's creative thinkers, it's scientists, it's employees, it's how you can push. But Debra, for you, how do you see it as do you see yourself as that sort of that irritant almost?
Yes. Yeah. I think a lot of people who know me would maybe use that word sometimes. Sometimes I refer to myself as a professional instigator. And again, I think it's like the power of underestimation, but also the power of not being tied to an institution. And that as artists, that's our job, right? Our job is to be thought-provoking, is to ask questions. And so for me, I'm very lucky that I get to work with a lot of people who are way smarter than me, right? Kind of cartographers, historians, scientists, anthropologists, all sorts of folks. And in some ways, I feel like because I am an artist and I don't know anything, I just ask a lot of questions. I'm like a 5-year-old who never grew up. I'm like, but why? And I think in part because I ask questions in that way, there's a kind of, first of all, there's a kind of like democracy of information, because these folks aren't threatened by me asking these questions, because I'm not trying to take their job. I'm not trying to, compete with their invention, whatever it might be. But also, I sometimes think that being in these spaces and asking very simple questions is really healthy, because there are certain ways that things just are done, and that's not good enough, right?
No, I think operating within the museum as I do, I often hear artists ask very basic, simple questions, and it's like, oh yeah, duh. It's like I should have thought about it like that. Russell, we're going to have to keep things moving along, as there is other people to involve as well in a minute. But I just wanted to have one final question from you, Russell. Was just how do you see in your role as an architect and engineer? You have so many different projects going on. How do you feel artists and creative thinkers and or community organizers have impacted how you think and about how you operate?
Oh gosh, how do I answer that question? I think the question of transparency, and if I just back up just a little bit to answer that, is in sustainability thinking, if we were to look at an arts organization like a museum, like MOCA, or just pick a museum, you would do a materiality study to understand where their impacts are, right? And so I think that on some levels, you would look at MOCA and think, well, the impact is the energy consumed, right? And the resources that go in to make the building operate. Okay, fair. Or you could say it's the social impact, it's the educational mission of the museum. That's totally valid on the social side. I would argue the economic side is where the key impacts are. And when you look at museums, when you look a lot at the art world as an industry and all of the money that's flowing through it, and when you dig down into who's sponsoring the exhibitions that you see upstairs or across the street, wherever they are, they're foundations, and they're mostly private foundations. And they're mostly private foundations established by high net worth people who made their money on Wall Street. Wall Street is an extractive-based capitalist economy, right, that we're all part of. And so for me, I think where I think there's a role for activism in the museum from an art standpoint, from a design standpoint, is asking where the money comes from, and is that money impacting other communities? So the impact of the operations of having an art museum even relies on a patron that has more benefits more from association with the museum, right, as a result of where they may have made their fortune, right? I mean, there's no, if you can afford $10 million for a painting, you've had an impact on a community somewhere that you're not paying for, right? That's what and we call that climate change.
I was just saying that this kind of issue of visibility is so important for artists, but also for institutions, and I think especially with something like climate change, that it's so abstract until you have moments of crisis, like what's happening in the Southeast right now, and it's only in those moments of crisis when suddenly it becomes visible. But I think for artists, part of what we can do, and I think also for institutions, is to kind of create these sort of structures of visibility that allow us to see things, like whether it's the movement of capital or the movement of carbon, that somehow the kind of complexity of that is something that we're all enmeshed in, and art can help make that visible. And I think the art world is a sphere of kind of hypervisibility. And so the choices also that artists or institutions make can become more visible and maybe even have an effect that goes beyond the art world itself.
Yeah, and I think that this conversation about the market and where we're going and how also technology it can be used in the future is a good segue. If David Nussbaum, you could join us on the stage, please. Thank you so much. Round of applause for David and for everybody, as no one gave a clap earlier.
Hello.
David, welcome.
Thanks.
So
that was really interesting. I hope I didn't just record scratch this whole thing. This was very, very impressive from everybody on the panel.
And just to introduce you, David, for those who might not know your work, David is a writer and producer who founded Proto, which you see here, after 20 years in the entertainment industry, including sports radio, television, podcasting, and live events. You have really used the hologram as a tool, and you have, as I understand, done live events with bringing back Whitney Houston, Ronald Reagan, also fashion shows, but you see this as a technology that is also for conferences, students, like an ability to bring people in, and on that note, I hope. I want to use your tagline, if you can't be there, beam there, and welcome in Bonnie Brennan. Hello, Bonnie. Here comes Bonnie.
Here comes Bonnie.
Yes,
all right.
She made it.
Hi. Hi. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you well. Can you hear us?
Yes.
Fantastic. Okay,
It works. Oh, goodness.
Live and beaming from New York City. So we couldn't get over this box, David, when it first arrived. It was really whether it's for anyone. Okay, this is me being very British again, but it was Doctor Who and the TARDIS, or there's so many different options. But can you just talk a little bit first before we bring Bonnie in fully about this technology and where you see it headed in the future?
Well, as a passionate broadcaster, content creator, one of the first things that I did when we started hologram entertainment, I've been in it for well over a decade. We were digitally resurrecting the late legends to posthumously perform. That guy's alive. Oh, goodness. You're seeing 3 of me.
Yes.
Oh, my goodness. What a treat. Instead of bringing back the dead, which was what we were doing, Whitney Houston, all of these amazing artists, Jenny Rivera, and they were performing on massive stages, much like when Tupac rose from the stage at Coachella in 2012. He was connecting with an audience that he wasn't able to for one very specific reason. Very controversial. It is, some say, macabre, let them rest in peace, and I tend to believe that sometimes. But it wasn't until I started to beam the living from where they were to where they needed to be that it all sort of connected with me. My background is in broadcasting, so the idea of if you can't be there, beam there was born. But obviously, these big giant hologram stages that we saw at Coachella just wasn't going to make it. It wasn't going to be a business. Certainly, you can't connect with an audience when you are on these massive stages behind magic tricks, like Pepper's Ghost, and it's not something that is scalable. The idea was to squeeze everything into a single passenger holoportation machine. So I started Proto, which is the world's first single passenger, completely self-contained digital real presence projection device. And Bonnie, who's beaming in from New York, 3,000 miles away, unable to be here, so we materialized her in, and she's having a much more real experience than what a traditional virtual communication platform might be like.
And in terms of sort of sustainability and mission, like how do you see Proto being used in the future, and how could it be used? I mean, at the moment it's quite a lot of setup, but
It's a single box though. So right now it's being shipped all over the world. We're in 25 countries. We're only 3 years old. We're already in 28 countries, and we're being permanently installed in financial institutions, in innovation centers, in museums, all in conference rooms. So once the device is set up, it's there. So how are we saving the environment? Because we're reducing the need for business travel. I beam everywhere now. I was in Australia, I was in Paris. I'm beaming into business meetings that I'm not going to jump on an airplane, go to the hotel, go to the meeting, go back to the I mean, there's a lot of time that you're saving as well when you're having these real presence projections as opposed to a Zoom, or even actually getting on a plane and physically going there.
And do you feel like that technology, like that this is going to be something that really, obviously Zoom caught on so quickly, and we use it all like hourly, but do you think that this is going to be something that is has a real life force? But we were talking when we zoomed, literally, back to Zoom, but about how this could be the means of allowing people to have a more physical presence, if they can't travel because of political reasons or something like this. Do you see this in the future?
Yeah, we're not trying to reduce Zoom to to anything other than it being a digital platform. Over my left shoulder, we're beaming in an astronaut here. So this is a way for people to connect with people in a way that they could not connect with them through traditional Zoom or other virtual platforms. The person beaming in actually has a bit of a Zoom experience. Bonnie is sitting in front of a camera. There's really not a whole lot of setup on her end. It's sort of like when you're sitting in front of your computer. On our end, we're seeing them like they're more real. So we're sort of like where Zoom stops and where physically being there begins. A much higher level of engagement, more connection with the audience, and it's just a much more real experience.
But there's there's an app of it as well. Is that you were mentioning that it was over a phone that you could do it?
Absolutely. I believe Bonnie's just sitting in front of a camera, but we do have an app on the phone.
Yes.
And we can sit a phone on a tripod, and no matter where you are in the world, you could beam into any device as long as you have access to it. And what's great about it is that it's like making a hologram phone call. You don't need anybody on the receiving side to do anything. You don't need technicians. It's not scary to operate, very user-friendly. I know how to use it, so I know that it's very easy to operate.
Michael and Debra and Russell, this is your first sort of introduction to the Proto, and mine too. What was your initial reaction to seeing Bonnie here? Anyone? I mean, I think we talk about is technology a way forward to what we're discussing as sustainability. Is this a means of pursuing new ideas? And we all learn from new things. I mean, I I think it's fantastic. I also think it's quite cumbersome. So I sort of am interested to see how it will be utilized in different contexts in the future.
Yeah, we made it just a little bit bigger than a larger than average person so that their entire body can be beamed. With Zoom, you lose a lot. With only being neck up, body language, nonverbal cues, very important when trying to communicate with people. We've got people that love it for all types of different types of communication. American Sign Language, for example, is a full body language.
Yep.
You can't do that on FaceTime and Zoom. It's very hard to do. So we have seen people not just communicate, but connect in a real way using Proto. And it's not just for people, but it's also for things. That was a photo from Art Basel. We had a half a dozen of our devices there, and artists were using it to beam their artwork, their NFTs, alongside the QR codes that allow people to, when they fall in love with the piece of art itself, they can just go right to the auction site or be able to check out. I'm going to let maybe Bonnie talk about this one over my shoulder. This was one of the greatest things Proto ever did, and thanks to Bonnie, we managed to get it done.
So I just wanted to give a quick introduction to Bonnie Brennan, who is the president of Christie's America and has had over 25 years in the auction business. Prior to her 10 years at Christie's, she was at Sotheby's for 15 years. Bonnie, we're thrilled to have you here. And we have the images. I'm not sure if you can see the images up that are on the wall, but they are your slides of the Giacometti and the Degas. And I think we'd just like to start about how Christie's kind of got involved with Proto, the use of this technology, and what you're hoping for in the future with this relationship.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. I think the Christie's has made a huge commitment to really focus on sustainability. As Russell said, I think he said it best, we shouldn't be competing, we should be sharing. And we made a bold statement of promising to be net zero by 2030. And so we've been thinking about how to embrace technology as we work towards that goal, and also how do we communicate what we're doing with the larger art world so that we can share those best practices with others. And Proto was a great discovery for us. It's a way for us to share artworks with buyers and clients around the world without actually having to travel very fragile works, which may be compromised during travel, but also helps us focus on those sustainability goals by limiting air freight. Great example was the Degas from the Anne Bass collection that we sold in May of 22. It was a terrific 3D sculpture that we filmed with the help of the Proto team, and we showcased it in Hong Kong, also in San Francisco. The work went on to sell for $41 million, which is the record for Degas. Some of the people who bid actually saw that picture, or saw the Proto, the Degas in the Proto when it traveled. And then it was so successful that we went on to actually showcase the Giacometti from the Givenchy collection. That was a sale that took place in Paris, but we showcased the Giacometti in our New York location for everyone who came in during our spring sales could see it.
And Bonnie, can you speak a little bit about sort of Christie's wider sustainability efforts? I mean, I was reading a lot about your commitment to sea travel rather than air freight, which is, I think, something also that, this is what, institutions and museums, we're not just the air travel of people, but the air travel of objects as well is a big factor in this conversation.
Sure is. Yeah, no, we really have three pillars. As I said, we're committed to being net zero by 2030. We're communicating what we're doing on an annual basis through our sustainability report. And finally, we're collaborating with sort of environmental-based initiatives. But our focus really is on 4 key initiatives. The first is shipping. You mentioned sea travel. We are trying to move away on a more regular basis to sea freight. With partners like Crozier, we have a monthly shuttle between London and Hong Kong and London and New York. We're also trying to curtail business travel. Using the Proto is a great way. I'm beaming to you today. We are looking forward to using the Proto not only for objects, but say, for example, our CEO, who's London-based, to participate in presentations with us in the US and in Asia. Our building operations, we're focused on really reducing the energy use in our buildings, working with environmentally sound partners. And then finally is printing. You know, the art world is printing far too many catalogs in our business, for example. We've reduced our catalog printing by 1 million catalogs in the last year. But those are really our key priorities so that we can reach that goal by 2030.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, this is the larger question about bringing in technology. How to, you know, it's great to learn about new technology, but it's really how can we become, you know, bring the global local? Like how can we stay? How can we reduce our travel? How can we reduce the shipping? Bonnie, just to, I think like one of the big things of like in such a large major institution like Christie's is what you feel your role is, and like how like the pressure that it is for Christie's to do something. As a leader, like where do you see your role in forwarding these initiatives?
Sure. No, I mean, everything we do now has to be seen through the lens of sustainability. We were the first ones to make that commitment to 2030, and now we really have to put actions behind that, which is what we're trying to do. But that is coming through motivation from our colleagues who really demand that focus, comes also from our clients. We see that, we all read the UBS report. We saw that climate considerations rate in the top 10 of our clients, our collectors' major concerns. We've also had great response from clients who say, we want to work with Christie's to sell our collection to benefit environmental conservation. We saw that in May with the Carl Knobloch and his family foundation. We also saw that in Artists Through Client Earth. We have had tremendous response when we sell works to benefit environmental causes. We saw that with the great Cecily Brown last fall in London, Rashid Johnson in November. So I think our role is really to share those messages and be leaders in that space.
I think that's a good kind of way to bring everyone in together, and what, you know, Debra, how would you sort of respond to some of these questions? I think as we're all sort of we talk about the art industry and also the wider, if you talk about architecture as well, there are so many different facets of this industry, and I think it's important that we are looking at both the market, nonprofit, and art making sort of arms of this. But yeah, I'm interested to know from all three of you like, some responses.
Yeah, I can start. I mean, I'm very excited to learn more about Christie's commitment to sustainability, and I think it's really important because I just in the kind of organizing that I'm doing and working with numerous institutions and galleries, I think one of the fears is always, well, the collector isn't going to want it shipped by sea. And so I think having that kind of change come from someone like Christie's is really important. And I think kind of normalizing the fact that we can't have everything we want right now is really, really important, right? And I would also say, I mean, I think that that like technology is amazing, and of course we need technology, but we are also not going to invent our way out of this. And I do worry that like the changes that we make have to be discussed openly as a part of a larger cultural shift to how we live in the world, because we can't continue as we are. It's like we're seeing right now what's happening just this weekend, right? So I think it's also like, this is very necessary because business has to continue, you know what I mean? Like we're not gonna fold up and you know, I don't even know where we would go. But I think it's important to really think about, especially, you know, organizations like Christie's, or for example, I'm working with the Getty, working with Pacific Standard Time, and have really been working with them to think like, how can we organize among the 50 participating institutions to really think like, collectively, we have to make this very visibly and vocally a part of what we do in order to be cultural leaders and to lead culture in this shift as to how we all behave and consider not just ourselves as people, but also all living systems. And Russell, I love what you were saying about the kind of impacts of things. Like I think a lot about what's downstream, right? And whether that's like downstream of a factory that's blowing air, or that's downstream of the LA River, whatever that might be, we're all responsible for each other. So we have to change the way we behave, ultimately.
Well, and it's hard not to get overwhelmed sometimes with this kind of topic. And, there's been, if you read about sustainability in the papers lately, or see, I'm dating myself already, the paper, every corporation is focused on ESG reporting, right? The stock markets or the Securities and Exchange Commission are embarking on a new rule to require companies to report on their climate risk, and they're using ESG reporting, which is environmental, social, and governance reporting, similar like Christie's sustainability report. Like most corporations are doing sustainability reporting now. And there's been a backlash to that, right? That ESG reporting is meaningless, or that people are overstating their gains, or they're not looking at, when I raised the question of where the real impacts are in a materiality study, right? Christie's operations is one thing, but all of the money their clients spend on art is the bigger impact. And so when you start looking at that, and your system boundary goes from your house to the city to the world, it's overwhelming. And I think, and I guess I've been doing it a long time, and again, maybe I'm like not enough of an activist, but I see these things as part of a journey, and that 20 years ago, Christie's probably didn't have a sustainability report, right? And now they've set a zero emissions target for 2030, which is great, right? I mean, that's a conversation that was not happening in our world before. And I think that it's so overwhelming and it's so depressing. We have to celebrate these things, and we have to see the progress we're making. And it's not, is it enough? I mean, no, but we're learning things, I think, and I see the industry evolving, just having this conversation, for example. But I do think, the way, and architecture is hugely bound up in this, in that, the question of the clients, where's the client's money coming from? We don't know the answer to that, right? It's not fully transparent. So much architecture, doing the quotes, sorry, so much architecture in LA, cities like LA and New York and London, is money laundering, pure and simple, right? Every high-rise residential building that's gone up in Beverly Hills in the last 10 years is money laundering. And the art market's right there with it, right? So, and that's what keeps me up at night, because most of that money laundering is looted from countries that can't afford to be looted, right? And so you want to see the climate losers? It's the people on the end of the looting, right? So, you can just paralyze yourself thinking about that. And so I try not to lose track of the progress and working with clients, because I have a 401k, my nose isn't clean. So.
Well, I think the sort of the other arm that we're not representing here is the client or the collector, and there's a big part of the art industry. And Bonnie, I was wondering if you could maybe respond to that in terms of how there's Christie's sustainability initiatives, but how these conversations you have with buyers, with clients, and where that kind of conversation goes.
Sure, yeah. No, I think our conversation, as I said, really starts oftentimes with their own collections and their own philanthropic goals. But we've also, as Russell said, it's also behavioral change, and talking to them about their own goals around not taking private air transportation to every fair, other ways to share artwork with them that allow them not to have to be there in person. I think that they're looking to us to be considered by them only sometimes based on our own standards. I mean, this whole climate, our reports is something that we are asked about more and more in our client presentations. It's become a baseline. I mean, thankfully, more of our clients have become used to transacting with us digitally. We've made huge leaps in terms of moving live sales online in order to streamline that process. So we don't have to move artwork so often. We don't have to have the same energy drain in our buildings for those exhibitions, and clients have responded with great activity through those channels.
I think it's also a good opportunity, like, if anyone has any questions in the audience. Yes, so at the back here. Sorry, there's a microphone just behind you.
Hi, I'm just curious. Can Bonnie see us? And if so, what exactly is she seeing?
She can see all of us. She's depending on where that camera is pointed. Welcome, Ryan.
Hello, I can see you all.
There's a camera that's right above Bonnie's head. There's two cameras. The bottom one is a return feed camera, so she's seeing the audience like she's sitting right beside me. The top camera is also, it's a sensor. It's a room sensor camera. So outside of the art world, if we were inside of a mall, for example, it would read the demographics of the room. So maybe when my 8-year-old daughter walks in front of it, or when my 80-year-old father walks in front of it, it'll see that it's a different type of person, and it'll play the piece of content that was made specifically for them.
Yes, here. Sorry. Michael, you wanted to respond quickly?
I was just thinking about your initial question about sort of our responses to this kind of change. And I think that these sort of small changes are good. And anything that people can do to kind of reduce their footprint is probably a step in the right direction. But I think that there is a kind of larger kind of wholesale change that needs to happen. And I think there's a whole kind of readjustment in terms of our values around art that can change. And I was just kind of, while we were looking at the Giacometti and the Degas, I was sort of just fantasizing, like, what if instead of having to see the Giacometti or the Degas only, like, what if instead it was what was being auctioned by Christie's maybe would be like a night where all the lights in empty buildings were shut off, and that was a work, and that was being auctioned, or a new forest would be created, or a peat bog would be kind of preserved as a work. Like, I think there's so many kind of new attunements to what could be a kind of not just carbon neutral, but a carbon negative way of sort of seeing what has aesthetic value that could kind of reorient like what we value and what collectors value and what art audiences value.
Yeah, I think that what collectors value is an interesting one, because we do have the sort of art washing, art laundering. It's and actually just one. I know question one moment, but Bonnie, on that note, given Michael and Russell's points, is there a conversation amongst Christie's about how collectors, and this is also this is for galleries as well. It is a means of art washing and people's murky funds.
Yeah, I mean, we have a very, very strict KYC policy for our buyers. I mean, obviously with recent sanctions, we've been very careful about who can participate in our sales. And I think, thankfully, the art headlines for both buyers and sellers has really been one around philanthropy. We have a season ahead of us where we're selling works on behalf of the Getty collection, Anne and Gordon Getty from San Francisco, many science and arts organizations locally there, and then the collection of Paul Allen. And all of that, over $1 billion, will go to charitable causes, several of which involve environmental support. So I think there's a negative story if you go look for it, but there's a much bigger positive one that I think is front and center right now.
Your question here?
My question's for David. I'd love to know more about how you think about the climate impact of this device, like specifically the sourcing the materials, the production, the transportation, the implementation, the operation from an energy perspective. Like, if you were to think about the carbon offset, like just taking a cue from Michael's project, how would you describe that?
Well, it takes about as much power as a room humidifier does. So you plug it into a 15 amp outlet and the entire process works. We wanted to make sure that this was very, low carbon footprint when using it. Also, the idea of the technology itself is for permanent installation. So, although art and museums and Christie's are very important to us, 95% of our customers are CEOs and entertainers and executives who not only need to be in one place. They need to be in multiple places. I've seen our religious leaders and professional speakers and even world leaders beam into dozens of countries around the world all in the same day. So if you can imagine what that would have cost the Earth to jump on an airplane and the jet fuel that spread from country to country to country, we beamed them from the safety and security of their own office or from their living room into all places simultaneously.
Yes, Amelia, just here. White hat. Down here.
Just a follow-up question on that. It's permanent install, but in 2 years when there's a better screen, or someone wants a CEO wants a bigger box. With tech, right, it has to get updated. So I would assume you'd have to send a big team to go update the boxes.
No, not exactly. We send a single tech with the device for installation. They are pretty maintenance-free. We don't have a lot of issues with them. We've got 40 engineers at Proto. 35 of those engineers are software engineers. The technology will continue to evolve, but not on the hardware side, but on the software side. Every month we have an update that hits 10 or 15 brand new things, stuff that you've watched in movies and television shows. You've seen it in the Jetsons and you've seen it in Back to the Future. We're doing those things. We're allowing people to walk in front of a device and have these interactions that really only existed in fantasy before.
One question that I had actually for Russell, because I meant to ask earlier, but so you are very involved in the Gallery Climate Coalition, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that project and how it kind of the bringing together of all of these strands of the art world can, like, we were talking about, one person can't do a lot, but if bring together a coalition can foster more change.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting movement because what's refreshing about it is that it's people just sharing their stories and what's working for them. And I've worked in sustainable design most of my career, and that's always one of the reasons I gravitated toward that is because it is an arena where people share and don't feel like, oh, I have the secret solution that no one else gets to hear. But also it just comes down to basic science too. So if you understand physics, but anyway, digression. But I think that it's amazing to me how that organization has just kind of blossomed, and so many people are participating and are taking it really seriously. And I think an ex-colleague of mine is here at MOCA now as
Simone Paz, I believe, who is here.
Oh, Simone's there.
Simone.
I mean, to think that MOCA has invested in having someone just focused on the operational impact full time. It's great. It's amazing to see that. And again, like from the journey perspective and thinking of positive outcomes. I mean, I think that this is just stuff that's happened in the last 5 years, and I think in another 10 years, it's going to be a whole different ball game. I mean, and the thing is that it's kind of, it deepens. It's not like we just do the same thing for 10 years. I think we're learning so much about the world and how to make the most impact. And so I do think it snowballs, even though the snowball's melting.
Good to bring some humor to a situation, yes. The snowball, but it's all good. It's melting, so it's not going to... We're going to drown, but not necessarily be... Any other audience questions? Yes, here. And then David afterwards.
Hi. Must say, as an artist, my experience looking at art over the past few years, and the awareness, this dialogue we're having now after 20 years, as you mentioned, it's good. But I can't see Michael Heiser anymore at LACMA without thinking about the dirty tractor-trailer trip it took through all the neighborhoods. I was in Beijing and I saw this Matthew Barney show. For the first time, I couldn't see the work. I just thought about the resources that it took to get these hunks of metal there. And I think until artists and curators and architects come together and start to focus on shows that are carbon neutral in carbon neutral venues, no shipping, everything, net zero from top to bottom, and set an example to the world that we can do this, then nothing's really going to change.
And maybe, Michael, could you respond to that, just in case, what you found while doing like your research for carbon copies, and like this, the extent, as as the gentleman says, about how just the process of art making is, so unsustainable.
At one point, I did calculate that Heiser trek for that rock. And that was purchased, so I guess it's been offsetted now. The carbon copy was purchased.
Thank you.
But I do think that like the kind of footprint of a work, it is part of how we understand and kind of appreciate or value a work. And I think it's so interesting that is a part of how you understand and kind of evaluate artworks now, and that's changed. I do think that there is this kind of, as I said, how the art world is kind of this sphere of sort of hyper visibility. I think that its artworks are more kind of open to that kind of evaluation and critique. I think that's a good thing, but I think we're more ready. I think it's because artworks don't need to exist in a way, so we're more aware of when they are excessive in a way, because we see them as not necessary. And I think that's part of the value of an artwork, is it's sort of beyond what's necessary. Whereas a building could have an enormous carbon footprint, but maybe we don't see that quite as much, even though it would dwarf any artwork really. So I think it's important to understand the art world sort of in context, that it's an artwork is embedded in so much more than itself and its own carbon footprint. But at the same time, I think it's the starting point to creating that kind of understanding and visibility that goes beyond the artwork to how we see the world, the whole world, and how it's enmeshed in these carbon cycles.
Yeah, art is a luxury, and so therefore it's like we think more about it in a way because we don't need it, we want it, and maybe we do need. I think we need culture, but it is something that you don't need to breathe. It's not going to. There's often a thing that we say is like an art crisis, not real crisis. It's like you might think it is, but it's not. David, I think you had a question.
First of all, thank you all for doing this. I know MOCA very much appreciates your doing the panel. It's so important. We've talked a lot about. You have all talked a lot about environmental sustainability. There is obviously this idea of environmental justice also. So I guess the question is, and I know you touched on it a little bit, but I guess the question is, what should the art world, what should museums, what should MOCA do for the community in this area?
Debra, maybe you take that one, if you want.
Wow, okay. Well, my first thing would say, invite the community in and ask what they aspire to, and ask what they want the role of the museum to be, instead of assuming that we're doing something for the community. It's like, let's create something with the community and think about what is the really direct impact that a museum may be having, or like what, I think we have to be adaptive right now, and I think that, and forever going forward, right? So I think it's also just looking at like what is happening in the community and how can the privilege of a museum be of service. And how can the privilege of a museum audience be of service with the folks who come through, and the donors and the benefactors and all of these kinds of things. I think it's really I think representation really matters, and so like really thinking about who is on the environmental council and how are they connected with the immediate community, I think is really important, and also thinking about the environmental crisis as a social crisis, because it is. And so not kind of limiting it to carbon impact, which of course is critical, but also thinking about, I think, I love the way that you speak about it as like the winners and losers. And I think like I don't love that, but you know what I mean? It makes it very clear, right? And we know that it's like the folks who have the least are the most impacted. And I think in a city like Los Angeles, we see that side by side. Like you see that on a street corner. So it's really thinking about like how can the museum be of service to all folks, and how can people feel invited and welcome, and also like how can we provide not only cultural conversation, but also cultural action that empowers people to both kind of like have agency in this moment of crisis that can be totally paralyzing, and also just like how to have a better life in a city that's becoming increasingly unlivable for climate and many other reasons.
Yeah, and I'll just follow up on that one because I think, my interest specifically is in performance and community programming, and I think that often museums seem inaccessible places to a lot of different audiences and communities, and it's our collective job, but to make people feel welcome, but also to expand what the museum audience is. It's not just a rarefied elite. It is, museums are a great space. It's sort of the flip side. Once you're in an institution, you're institutionalized, and that can be that kind of feels as though there's no room for experimentation, but there is, and it's like you got to use that platform as to really bring new ideas, and I think that's what a lot of different public programming like this, or performance, or things that are happening in real time where people can be responsive. That's where it can happen.
And I would also just add to that, I feel really strongly that museums should be a community resource, right?
No, 100%.
So also really thinking about, I think the work of the Environmental Council is amazing. I'm so grateful to be a part of this panel and a part of this conversation, and really thinking about how can it go one step further to, maybe there are people who are curious about how to get involved in, supporting environmental impact in a positive way. And so maybe as a part of programming, just like to be more, I'm not saying to be more resourceful, I'm just thinking about like how we can, as a community, be more resourceful about who we kind of share space with, right? And who we invite to be a part of the conversation. And how we bring folks to new audiences that may be museum goers in a way that can positively impact the work that they're doing on the ground.
I'm just seeing the time, so I don't know if we could all talk for a long time. But does anybody else have any questions before we bring this to a close? No? Well then, thank you. I wanted to thank Russell and Debra, Michael, David, and Bonnie.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
And also, of course, to Francis and Livia. But we will be having another conversation, October 22nd, looking at digital art specifically with Glenn Kino and Nancy Baker Cahill. Sorry, oh my God, my brain. So please, come back again and keep participating. But thank you so much.